The sun cast a soft glow on the street as Jaden Grace, a 16-year-old with dreamy eyes, stepped onto the basketball court. Every day after school, he spent hours here practicing his shots, dreaming of one day becoming a college league star. His movements were fluid, confident, as if he was born to play. But on this day, everything changed. The game started as usual. The opposing team was strong, but Jaden held the defense brilliantly. In the stands, a small group of spectators, including his younger sister Layla, cheered him on. At one point, the tension peaked. Jaden had the ball, and he raced toward the ring, avoiding his opponents. Suddenly, one of his opponents awkwardly planted his foot, and what happened next seemed like a slow-motion movie. Crackle, a thud, screams. Jaden fell, hitting the concrete pad hard. It was as if someone had pulled the rug out from under him. The pain pierced his leg with such force that he couldn't hold back the tears. The screams of the fans fell silent, replaced by anxious whispers. His father, Marcus Grace, rushed to his son from the stands. Layla cried, clenching her fists. When the ambulance arrived, Jaden was still trying to convince himself that it was just a bad bruise. But the doctors were silent, and their looks said more than words. Later at the hospital, the diagnosis was devastating: a compound fracture with ligament damage. His basketball career, which he had been living, suddenly collapsed. A week later. Jaden sat on the couch in the living room, staring at his crutches. They stood against the wall, a reminder that his life would never be the same again. He listened to his father and mother whispering about his condition in the next room. Their voices sounded anxious but firm. Marcus said they would do anything to make sure Jaden recovered. "I've lost everything," he muttered, clutching the old ball in his hands. Layla, who had quietly entered the room, sat down next to him. "You haven't lost us," she said, hugging her brother, "and you'll show us what you can do." But he couldn't believe it so easily. Every day, every step on those damn crutches reminded him how vulnerable he was. His dreams had crumbled like a house of cards, but something deep inside told him it wasn't over. He didn't even realize how right that inner voice was. The sunny morning promised to be calm, almost routine. Jaden, armed with his crutches and school backpack, walked slowly to the bus stop. This was his new reality. No more fast steps, no more jogging, just slow, careful movements. He tried to get used to it, though each step seemed a reminder of the freedom he had lost. As he crossed a quiet intersection, a police car suddenly stopped beside him. Painted the standard black and white color, with blinkers that didn't flash this time, the car looked harmless. But something about the way the window slowly rolled down made Jaden wary. "Hey, you!" The officer's voice was harsh and commanding. "Come here." Jaden stopped, looking at the patrolman confused. The officer, a large white man with a square face and an icy stare, got out of the car and walked toward him with his hands behind his belt. "Is something wrong?" Jaden asked, trying to keep his voice calm. The officer glared at him from head to toe. It wasn't just a glance, it was a scan, assessing and demeaning at the same time. "Where did you get that backpack?" he asked sharply. Jaden frowned. "That's my backpack. I'm going to school." "Ah, school." The officer stretched out, grinning. "Are you serious? Listen, we've got a report of a car theft nearby. You wouldn't happen to be the one who tried to flee the scene, would you?" Jaden froze. The cop's words sounded so absurd that for a second he thought he'd misheard him. "Me? On crutches? Are you serious?" "Don't get smart, kid." The officer stepped closer, his face contorted with anger. We have reason to believe you're connected to this. You've been loitering around here, right?" Jaden felt rage boiling in his chest. He'd always heard from his father that it was best not to argue with the police, but this accusation was so wild that he couldn't keep quiet. "I'm just going to school," he said, trying to keep his voice low. "How do you think I could steal a car? I can't even walk properly." The policeman smirked, paying no attention to his words. "You think I'm going to buy that pathetic story? You're all good at games, especially when you have to play the innocent. All of you." The two words, spoken with emphasis, hit Jaden harder than a physical blow. He felt the blood rush to his face, but the officer had already begun rummaging through his backpack, which he'd snatched without permission. "Hey, you have no right to do that," Jaden shouted. "I'll decide what I'm going to do," the officer replied without looking at him. "We have a report of a suspicious person, and you fit the description perfectly." "What's the description? A black guy with a backpack?" Jaden couldn't help himself. The officer looked up sharply, his eyes flashing. "You watch how you talk. You understand? You're not at home here." Jaden felt himself growing cold. He'd never been told something like this so openly, so harshly. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. The crowd of bystanders had already begun to gather, some of them pulling out their phones, recording what was happening. "Great, we're putting on a show," the officer said contemptuously, picking up his backpack and defiantly shaking its contents onto the asphalt. Books, notebooks, pencil case, everything flew to the ground. "I didn't do anything," Jaden shouted. "Call my father. He's a lawyer." "Yeah, sure, lawyer." The officer laughed as if it was a joke. "Look, kid, it doesn't matter what your daddy does for a living. I'm the law." Jaden felt humiliated beyond belief. People stared at him, some whispering, some laughing, but there were also those who looked with obvious judgment at the officer. One of the passers-by, a tall man with a camera, stepped forward. "Hey, go easy on the guy," he said. "Can you see he can't even move properly? Leave him alone." The officer turned to the man, clearly displeased. "This is none of your business. Step back, or you'll be detained too." But the video continued to record. Jaden stood, tears of anger and humiliation welling up in his eyes. He had never felt such a combination of helplessness and rage before. He knew one thing: his father wouldn't just let it go. Jaden stood leaning on his crutches in the middle of the busy street under the cold gaze of a policeman. People walked by, glancing around, but no one stopped. Officer Wilkins, a stocky white man with a look of perpetual irritation on his face, stood across from Jaden, as if waiting for the moment to attack. His partner watched lazily from the patrol car, as if what was happening was routine. "I repeat, where did you get the car keys?" Wilkins asked, holding up the keys that Jaden had dropped while trying to adjust his backpack. "Those are my father's keys. The car is parked outside the cafe," Jaden answered, trying to stay calm, though his voice shook. "I was just walking home." "Home, then?" Wilkins curled his lips into a mocking smile. "What kind of car is this? A new one with leather interior, I bet. Are you sure it's yours? Maybe you decided to borrow it from someone?" "I didn't steal anything." Jaden felt his anger boiling inside him. He looked into the officer's eyes, trying to tell the truth, but he faced an icy wall of prejudice. Wilkins stepped closer, so close that Jaden could smell tobacco and coffee. His gaze was heavy with contempt. "Do you know how often I hear that 'I didn't steal anything' thing?" the officer said, leaning toward Jaden with a grin. "You know who gets caught lying the most? People who look, well, like you." The words, spoken with hateful certainty, hit Jaden under the breath. He wanted to object, but a sense of humiliation mixed with anger shook him. His hands clutched the handles of his crutches. "Look," he began again, struggling to keep his composure. "If you don't believe me, call my father. He'll confirm that the car belongs to him." But Wilkins only hummed and said loudly, almost mockingly, "A father, you say? Tell me he's a doctor or a lawyer." "He's a lawyer," Jaden answered firmly, though he was trembling inside. "Sure, a lawyer," Wilkins said sarcastically. "What kind of lawyer would let his son walk the streets on crutches and try to steal a car?" The words cut Jaden like a knife. A small crowd of onlookers had already begun to gather around him. People stopped, pulling out their phones. Some were whispering quietly. Some were openly filming, but no one intervened. "Do you really think people like you can afford cars of this caliber?" Wilkins continued, deliberately loud enough for everyone to hear. His voice was full of sarcasm and contempt. "I'd be honest if I were you. It wouldn't be any worse for you." "I didn't steal anything," Jaden shouted, his voice breaking and tears welling up in his eyes. "Why don't you believe me? They're just keys and I—" But Wilkins interrupted him by slamming his keys against the hood of the patrol car. The sound echoed down the street. "Stop lying. You think your wounded leg makes you innocent?" The officer grabbed Jaden by the collar of his shirt, causing him to stagger. One of his crutches fell, and the teenager barely kept his balance. "Enough! This is humiliation!" someone in the crowd shouted, but the voice was immediately silenced by the hard stare of Wilkins' partner. Jaden felt completely defenseless. The crowd wasn't on his side. They were just spectators. It was the moment when he realized that to most people he was just another troubled teenager. The ringing of the phone interrupted the tension. It was his father, Marcus, who immediately sensed something wrong when he heard his son's confused voice. "Hang in there, Jaden. I'm on my way," he said firmly. But Jaden was beginning to doubt that it mattered. To someone like Officer Wilkins, he was guilty by definition. The officer's cold stare, his firm fingers clutching the radio, and the cold weapon on his hip all came at Jaden like the ultimate form of threat. The cop, whose name was on his badge as S. Barrows, came closer, so close that Jaden could smell the odor of cheap tobacco and sweat. "Didn't you hear me?" the officer asked sharply, shoving the teenager in the shoulder. The crutches creaked, and Jaden barely kept his balance. "Tell the truth, boy. Did you steal this car?" "I didn't touch your car." Jaden's voice shook, but he tried to sound confident. "I don't even have a license." The officer laughed, low and cold, as if he had heard a ridiculous joke. "Oh, so no rights? That explains it, of course. You can't even pass your driver's license and still steal a car, right? Typical." He stopped talking, but the words he didn't say hung in the air. Everyone around him knew what he wanted to say. Jaden tried to keep his composure, but resentment flared inside. The crowd of bystanders was growing. Someone pulled out a cell phone, filming what was happening, but no one intervened. It was none of their business. Their faces said they were just spectators. "I told you, I didn't steal anything. I'm just going home, I'm injured." Jaden lifted his crutches as if to prove his helplessness. But to the officer, it was just an excuse to show power. Barrows abruptly grabbed the crutches from the teenager's hands and tossed them aside. "Nothing? You expect me to believe that? Hell, maybe you're hiding a gun in that backpack too." He yanked Jaden's backpack off his shoulder, shaking its contents out onto the pavement. "Hey, you have no right!" Jaden shouted, losing his balance and falling to his knees. Pain shot through him, but the policeman didn't even look in his direction. Instead, he rummaged through the scattered books, phone, and personal belongings as if looking for a weapon. I'm sure you're so used to living on freebies. No schooling, no work, just looking for something to steal. Barrow's words were an indictment of everything Jaden represented: his skin color, his youth, his dreams. The crowd around them began to whisper. Some of the bystanders clenched their fists, but fear of the uniforms kept everyone in place. There were whispers of, "This is wrong," and "Why is he doing this to him?" But no one took a step forward. When Jaden tried to stand up, leaning on his hands, the officer commanded, "Freeze, boy! You think I'm going to let you pull a knife or something worse?" And before Jaden could answer, Burroughs stepped forward and slapped him hard on the shoulder, causing him to fall again. Jaden collapsed to the sidewalk, his face hid in the concrete and the metallic taste of blood on his lips. It wasn't just a blow, it was a lesson in submission that the officer had decided to teach. "Stay still," Barrows shouted, pulling out his handcuffs. "Why? What did I do?" Jaden screamed, tears of rage and humiliation streaming down his face. "I didn't do anything." Passers-by were filming, their phones pointed at what was happening, but their eyes were full of fear. A woman with a child stood a little closer, but her husband grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Enough!" came a voice from the crowd. It was a young man standing on the other side of the street, but the officer raised his hand to stop him. "Shut up. This is police work." His words sounded like an order. Everything became a blur for Jaden. The pain, the humiliation, the screams in the crowd, the bright light of the sun reflecting off the cop's metal badge, and the thoughts of why no one was intervening. He closed his eyes, feeling the cold handcuffs tighten around his wrists. His world was crumbling before his eyes, but he swore to himself that this was only the beginning. He would come back for the truth, if only he could escape this darkness. The phone in the Grace home rang late at night when Marcus Grace, tired after a long day at work, finally settled on the couch with a file of cases. He glanced at the screen. It was Jaden calling. His son was usually home at this hour, so the call seemed strange. Marcus picked up the phone, expecting to hear something like a request to pick something up from the store, but instead it was a broken voice. "Dad, I need to go home. They did this to me. Just like that." "Jaden, what's wrong? Where are you?" The tension in Marcus's voice instantly replaced his tiredness with anxiety. His son's words sounded confused. He was choking back sobs. "The policeman..." Jaden stopped, choking back a sob. "He hit me, Dad. They said I stole the car. I said I didn't do it, but he wouldn't listen. They took my crutches. I couldn't do anything." Marcus felt cold inside. He heard the pain, the humiliation, the fear in his son's voice. The words "stole the car" and "took the crutches" hit him like a blow. He tried to speak calmly, even though his rage was beginning to boil over. "Where are you now? Are you safe?" "I'm at the bus stop. People are looking at me, but no one is helping." Marcus drove out of the house without waiting for an explanation. He drove so fast that passing drivers honked nervously. Jaden wasn't a criminal. He knew that. But something told Marcus that the problem went much deeper than just police error. When he arrived at the designated spot, he saw his son sitting on the curb, alone. His face was broken, his clothes were stained with dirt, and one of his crutches lay off to the side. Jaden looked like a hurricane had blown through him. Marcus got out of the car and rushed over to his son. "Jaden, it's me. Are you okay?" His voice shook with anger and helplessness. "No, Dad." Jaden looked at him with a look of despair. "They looked at me like I was just trash. They wouldn't let me say a word." Marcus hugged his son, trying not to show that he was shaking with rage. He sat Jaden in the car and took the details from him. He told how the cop had pulled him over, how he'd accused him of stealing the car without even trying to figure it out, and how he'd used force to take his crutches. "Did you remember his name?" Marcus asked, struggling to contain his emotions. "No." Jaden lowered his eyes, but he had dark glasses and a chevron. He said I was one of them. That's all people like me do. Those words were the last straw. Marcus felt his hands clench into fists. "Nothing," he breathed out. "I'll find out who he is. I'll find him." Back home, Marcus sat his son on the couch, treated his wounds, and made sure he was physically okay. But what he had seen and heard already stuck in his mind like a burning blade. His boy, his pride, had been humiliated and beaten for no reason. And he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let it go. He sat down at his laptop, intent on finding any data on the incident. He knew the police would protect their officer, but this case would become personal. He is a lawyer, and now all his energy will be focused on getting justice for his son. "I won't let them ruin your life, Jaden," he said, sitting in front of the screen. There was an icy fire in his eyes. "No one." Attorney Marcus Grace's office was like a battlefield. Stacks of documents piled up on his desk, his phone was ringing off the hook, and his laptop displayed dozens of open tabs with laws, case law, and regulations. But behind the clutter was determination. The determination of a father who wasn't going to accept the humiliation and abuse his son had endured. After Jaden's call, filled with tears and fear, Marcus went to the station to file a formal complaint. His encounter there, however, resembled a theater of the absurd. The officer on duty lazily flipped through the application, casting him a blank stare. "We'll look into it," he said, not even trying to hide his boredom. "You do realize how difficult it can be to figure out what's going on, don't you? Maybe your son did something that raised suspicions." "My son is on crutches," Marcus replied with barely contained rage. There was nothing he could do to justify such violence. But Marcus's words ran into an invisible wall. It wasn't just indifference. It was a system carefully constructed to protect its own, even if they broke the law. Every step Marcus took was met with resistance. His request for copies of the officer's body camera footage was denied because of technical problems. His son's case was suddenly classified in the interest of the investigation. The police officer involved in the attack was suspended, but his name was not released and his colleagues declined to comment. Marcus began to gather evidence himself. He contacted people who had witnessed the incident, but most of them were afraid to talk. The risk of trouble with the law was too great. Only one person agreed to hand over a video taken on his phone, but even this video was later called into question because of police claims of possible falsification. It soon became clear that the case was gaining public resonance. The video of the incident was leaked online and started gaining views. People were divided. Some condemned the actions of the police, while others, on the contrary, claimed that Jaden was to blame. Marcus sensed that the system wasn't just resisting, it was launching a counterattack. Anonymous accounts popped up on social media claiming that Jaden had allegedly been involved in petty offenses before. Someone even found an old photo of the teen with friends, captioning it as "Hijacker Gang." "It's a dirty game," said his colleague, also a lawyer. "They are protecting their own. They want to wear you down." Marcus didn't give up. He filed a formal request for prosecution with the prosecutor's office, took the case to the press, and began engaging civil rights organizations. Every day was a battle. For every paper, every word of support, every drop of justice. The system was working against him, but he knew that right now was the time to stop. He needed to show that his son was not just a victim of violence, but a symbol for all those who faced injustice. There was no doubt in his eyes. Either he would win or he would collapse along with this case. And he wasn't going to fall. Marcus Grace sat at his massive oak desk in his home office. A pile of documents lay in front of him, printouts from the internet, and dozens of tabs flashed on his laptop. His face was tense, but his gaze was focused. Jaden's father wasn't just a lawyer, he was a master of his craft, skilled at uncovering the most carefully hidden secrets. And this time, his adversary wasn't just a racist cop, but the entire system that had covered up his actions for years. The first clue came out of the blue. One of the videos shot by a passerby on that fateful day had garnered millions of views on social media. The comments poured in endlessly, and among them popped up messages that made Marcus wary. Several claimed that this officer, Sergeant Davis, had been in scandalous situations before, but had always gotten away with it. Marcus sensed that there was something more behind it. Marcus started digging deeper. He pulled up a database of complaints against police officers that he had access to through his professional connections. At least 6 complaints had been filed against Davis in the last 3 years. Each contained similar descriptions: excessive use of force, racial slurs, false accusations. But, amazingly, none of the cases went to trial. Marcus contacted several of Davis's victims. One of them, an African-American small store owner, described how Davis had repeatedly detained him for no reason, threatening to close his business for illegal activity. Another, a young teacher, recalled how he was pulled over on the road for suspicious behavior and humiliated in front of his students. "They always find a way to justify him," the teacher said, grinning bitterly. "He's their man. They have his back from above." This statement was like a lightning strike for Marcus. He realized that Davis was not just a racist, but part of a system that deliberately ignored his actions. Further investigation revealed an even more sinister side. Marcus hired a private investigator to dig up Davis's connections. It turned out that the officer had relationships with local businessmen who donated large sums to the police union. This money, as it turned out, was used to hush up embarrassing cases. But the most shocking revelation was a report found in the archives. In 2018, Davis was involved in an arrest that ended in the death of a detainee. The case was quickly closed, and Davis himself was transferred to a new position. The family of the deceased never got the truth. Marcus knew that now he had everything he needed to destroy Davis's reputation. But he realized that the truth alone was not enough. The system would resist until the last possible moment. So he decided to take a different route. "We'll bring this to the light," he said to Jaden and his wife, gathering the evidence folder. They were used to working in the shadows. But now the world will see who Davis is and what this system can do. Marcus approached journalists willing to publish the results of his investigation. The next day, major news portals exploded with headlines: "Racism protected by law, the shocking truth about Sergeant Davis." The video and documents went viral, and public outrage began to build. Davis seemed to have lost his former confidence. He was suspended from his job, and the police said they were launching an internal investigation. But Marcus knew that this was only the beginning. He was ready to fight to the end because for him it had become not just a case, but a mission, to restore justice and show his son that evil could not go unpunished. At first, it was just a short video shot on a shaky smartphone by a passerby. No preparation, no editing, just chaotic shots. A teenager on crutches screaming his innocence, and a police officer who ignores his words. The officer's derogatory comments and words that clearly come from racist prejudice are heard in the footage. "You're all like this, always looking for somewhere to steal." The footage culminated in a shocking image. A teenager knocked to the ground by brute force, screaming in pain, and an officer bending down to handcuff his skinny wrists. This video appeared online the next day. One of the witnesses posted it on the platform with the caption, "This is what justice looks like for a black teenager in our country." Within hours, the video went viral on social media. Thousands of people began sharing it with hashtags like #Justice for Jaden, #Racism in System, #Black Lives Matter. The atmosphere in the Gray's house was heated to the max. Marcus, usually reserved and confident, paced the room, holding his head. His wife sat at the table, staring at the laptop, where the comments under the video were multiplying at a staggering rate. "Look," she said, showing the screen. "It's the senator. He shared the tape, and some activist wrote that he was going to come here to support us." "This is just the beginning," Marcus answered, but there was no joy in his voice. "This story isn't just about Jaden. People see it as something bigger, systemic. This could be a storm." Meanwhile, Jaden sat in his room. He stared at the screen of his phone, where notifications were coming in every minute. In private messages, some were expressing support. Some were writing about their own experiences with racial discrimination. But there were also those who made threats, calling him a liar and a criminal. He came out into the living room, struggling on crutches. "Dad," he said, his voice shaken, "what if they try to cover it up? What if it all ends up as usual?" Marcus stopped and looked at his son. "They won't be able to," he replied. "It's too loud this time." The next day, a crowd of journalists gathered in front of the Gray's house. Cameras glowed, microphones extended toward Marcus, who stepped out onto the threshold. He raised his hand, calling for silence. "We appreciate your support," he began. "But I want you to know that this is not just my son's case. This is a case about how a system designed to protect betrays its citizens. My son was defenseless, and he was accused not because he did anything wrong, but because he looks different. I will not stop until justice is served." The speech drew a flurry of applause. Some of those in attendance began chanting Jaden's name, while others held placards that read, "Down with racism. Swing justice now." At the same time, there was panic in the police station. The video attracted the attention not only of the public, but also of investigative journalists. Old cases involving the officer who assaulted Jaden began to surface. Citizen complaints, previously ignored, now became public. "What are we going to do?" one of the senior officers asked the station chief. Things were out of control. "Nothing yet," the chief replied, tapping his fingers nervously on his desk. "Let the lawyers work. It'll blow over. It always does." But this time it was different. Every action of the police only fueled public interest. Loud comments from celebrities, rallies in front of the station, reports on the central channels, the case was gaining momentum. A few days later, Marcus received a call. It was a well-known human rights activist offering legal assistance. They arranged a meeting to discuss further actions. "This is more than we could have expected," Marcus told his wife after the conversation. "Now we have a real chance. But it's going to be a tough fight." He looked at Jaden, who was sitting in the corner of the room. "Are you ready for what's going to be hard next?" "I'm ready," Jaden answered, clutching his crutches. "I want them to know the truth." And the truth was already starting to flow to the surface. But would it be enough to break an entire system? That remained to be seen. The courtroom was packed. The news cameras lined the wall, their lenses aimed at Marcus Grace, who was calmly spreading out the papers on the table. Despite everything that was going on, he looked focused, as if he were preparing for a game of chess rather than one of the most important cases of his career. His son, Jaden, sat behind him, leaning on crutches. A trace of strain was visible on his face, but he held firm. This wasn't just a trial, it was a battle for his dignity and his future. On the opposite side sat Officer Douglas Carter. His gaze was icy, his whole demeanor confident, as if he were untouchable. Next to him was the police attorney, an experienced and calculating lawyer whose main job was to make Jaden look like the aggressor and the officer like a victim of compelling circumstances. The first to speak was the police lawyer. His voice sounded loud, convincing, and he got straight to the point. "Gentlemen of the jury, we are here to get to the truth. My client, Officer Carter, acted within the law in defense of public order. We will prove that his actions were justified, and any accusations of racism are just an attempt to sensationalize the case." But then it was Marcus's turn. He stood up, looked around the jury, and his voice, confident but full of emotion, filled the room. "Gentlemen and ladies, I'm not here to sensationalize. I'm here to show you how a system that is supposed to protect can destroy lives. And today, we're not just talking about my son. We're talking about how injustice takes root if it's allowed to." Marcus began to present evidence. The first he showed was a video taken by eyewitnesses. The video clearly showed Officer Carter using force against Jaden, despite his crutches and apparent helplessness. The scene of the police officer pushing the teenager to the ground and shouting derogatory phrases made the audience gasp. "Officer Carter," Marcus called him in for cross-examination, "you say you were following protocol. Could you explain exactly what protocol allows you to beat an injured juvenile on crutches?" Carter hesitated, but then stated, "He fought back. I couldn't know what was on his mind." Marcus didn't back down. He had crutches next to him, not a weapon. You consider that a threat? Witnesses took the stand at the trial. One of the eyewitnesses, an elderly man who shot the video, described how he felt helpless seeing what was happening. "I was afraid to get involved. I could see it was racist, but who was I to stop a policeman? I just had to get it on camera." Marcus escalated the heat by presenting reports of previous incidents involving Carter that he had managed to obtain. They made it clear that the officer had been repeatedly accused of excessive brutality and prejudice against African Americans. Despite complaints, he escaped punishment each time. "It's not just a fluke," Marcus told the jury. "This is a pattern, a systemic problem. And if we don't take a step toward justice today, there will only be more stories like this." After days of intense questioning, arguing, and presentation of evidence, it was time for the final speech. Marcus stood up, his voice quiet but weighty. My son is just one of many. Many never make it to this courtroom. They remain just names and statistics. But today, you can show that the system can change, that truth and justice can prevail, even if it means breaking the mold. The police lawyer's closing speech sounded like a desperate attempt to justify himself. But the hall seemed to have already made up its mind. The judge announced that the verdict would be delivered the next day. People were leaving the courtroom waiting to see what the outcome of this brutal but necessary struggle would be. When Marcus walked outside with Jaden, a crowd gathered around. They applauded. The world seemed to look at this family with hope that their fight would be the beginning of something bigger. When the judge announced the verdict, there was a deafening silence in the hall. Everyone waited. Would justice prevail, or would the rotten mechanism of the system show itself again? Police officer Brian Colton has been found not guilty on all charges. Marcus Grace, Jaden's father, froze as if paralyzed. Nearby, his son, still struggling on crutches, bit his lip to hold back tears. He felt his heart clench with despair. There were shouts of outrage, someone threw a chair, and the court guards rushed to break up the crowd. But worst of all was Colton's gaze, his icy, mocking expression. He grinned slightly, glancing at Marcus and Jaden before leaving the courtroom, accompanied by his lawyers. For the Grace family, that day was not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. Outside the court, protests grew. The video of Jaden's arrest continued to circulate on social media, racking up millions of views. The hashtags number Justice for Jaden and number System Under Threat topped global trends. Crowds of people took to the streets demanding justice. Graffiti depicting Jaden on crutches, a symbol of defenselessness against the system, appeared on city walls. Marcus gathered the family in the living room of their house. "We're not done yet. We will go beyond the court. We have the truth, and it is stronger than any laws." His voice sounded firm, but even he knew that words could not wash away the bitterness of defeat. Colton, confident of his complete victory, did not realize that his past was now being scrutinized by journalists and activists. A week after the trial, new evidence emerged. Several of Colton's former colleagues had anonymously disclosed his regular racist remarks and abuses of power. Even earlier, he had suppressed evidence against him thanks to connections in the department's leadership. One of the accusations resounded particularly loudly. 10 years ago, Colton had beaten a young African-American man who later died in the hospital. The case was hushed up, but now it has been brought back to the surface. The revelations were stunning and only fueled the protests. The crowd outside the police building grew day by day. Investigative notices and media coverage began to make police brass nervous. First, several officers were fired to calm the tide of discontent. Then, Colton was administratively penalized. But it wasn't enough. One night, a mob blinded by anger tried to break into the police station where Colton worked. Law enforcement responded violently. Clashes broke out. Tear gas, water cannons, burning cars, panic gripped the city. But amidst the chaos, one thing was clear. People were not going to be silent any longer. At this time, Colton himself was at the epicenter. His home was under attack. Social media circulated his address, and a mob surrounded his property. Colton jumped out onto the porch with gun in hand, threatening to defend himself. But under the pressure of fear, he accidentally fired and hit his own son, who came outside to see what was happening. This incident was a tragic ending to his career. Colton was arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter. His lawyers pleaded for leniency, but no one would listen. For Marcus and Jaden, it was a bittersweet victory. They didn't want the child or Colton dead, but the consequences of the officer's actions were clear to everyone. Evil always comes back, even if the laws protect it. A few months later, Jaden returned to the same basketball court where his accident had occurred. He threw the ball into the hoop, standing on one foot, and smiled. "Sometimes you fall down, but that doesn't mean you can't get up," he told his sister, who was filming him on her phone. The video has become a new symbol of the fight for justice. What do you think of this story? Write your thoughts in the comments. Maybe you or someone you love has experienced racism. Share your experience. Your voice is important, and it's stories like this that make a difference in the world. We are incredibly appreciative of each and every one of you who support this topic and join the discussion. Thank you for your activism and pursuit of justice. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like if this story touched you. This helps us share important topics with even more people. We wish you a good day, and remember, every vote counts.